Let's talk about another public intellectual.
Um, you've asked me to attend, so I suppose the seventh is in this kind of very exotic place, which I'm sure he might, at one level, have approved of, because he taught me jurisprudence, Ronald Dworkin, and his style of teaching was conversational and informal. He was like a continental philosopher in that way, but he was more rigorous, much more so. He's the leading philosopher of law. And when I studied jurisprudence in UCL, he was one of the phalanx of people, although he was only a visiting professor. But I've written about his work, and I lectured jurisprudence for many years, which is the philosophy of law. Now, sometimes it is perceived to be a slightly arcane subject, but Dworkin was also not just a legal philosopher, but also a political philosopher, and to some extent a moral philosopher. Um, and and he fits the tag of the public intellectual perfectly, because he spent so much of his time raking the cash in, writing for things like New York Review of Books and all of those sort of things. But that is not to undermine the achievement. And there's numbers of points of relevance for this day and age. First of all, in terms of his understanding of the legal process, Dworkin was a great believer in the idea that lawyers are too inclined to think of the black letter interpretation of a rule. The statute says this, a case says that, and apply it. And Dworkin says law, which I believe is true, is inherently argumentative and interpretive. If you take the example of two barristers in a case, he was doing a case today, trial. One says X, Y, Z, the other stands up, says A, B, C. They're involved in an argument and interpretation of what something is or is not. And the judge is the arbiter of that. So he said law is inherently argumentative and interpretive. Now, I think that is correct at one level. He perhaps, to his critics, extends this too far, because ultimately he reaches a thesis called the right answer thesis, which over time becomes the best answer. That now, there's nothing wrong with the pursuit as such, that a judge or a lawyer should always be involved in the exercise of trying to achieve the best interpretation or the best answer to any legal question. But Dworkin's best answer ultimately ends up, at one level, according to his critics, conforming to his very liberal view of the world, a liberal American view of the world. So, for example, there is fundamentally a woman's right to choose, interpretively, the right to abortion. There is a right to die, the right to euthanasia, interpretively. Now, his critics, with some merit, say this is turning law into a politicized exercise, and the technical interpretivism is leading to political goals. Jonathan Sumption, the retired Supreme Court judge in Britain, had written a review of his book, Reith Lectures, which hasn't come out yet, but he points out, which is a fair point, that the concept of human rights, the politicization of it, has perhaps at one level given the judiciary too much power, and too much power is invested in the judiciary. And when they get involved in deeply divisive questions like abortion and euthanasia, the shit really hits the fan. I mean, the damage Roe versus Wade has caused in America is enormous, in terms of the appointment of Supreme Court judges, or who is not appointed, in terms of endless attempts to get it overturned, and in terms of wars demonstrated in such documentaries, Lake of Fire, where abortion doctors are killed and murdered for performing abortion. So perhaps legal processes and courts are not the best arbiter, except in exceptional circumstances, of politicized questions. And Dworkin's critics say that he is, one of his famous books is Law's Empire. He's investing judges as custodians and guardians of the universe, which is not what they should ultimately be doing. Now, there's some merit in that as a criticism. And Habermas, who was a great opponent of Dworkin's at one level, said, well, my preference is not for judge and co, as Bentham would call them, but for legislative processes and democracy. Now, of course, the problem is, and here's where Dworkin has a point, in a universe of totally declining educational standards, where the politicians are in a spectrum, I read recently, between Nero and Caligula, and the world has turned bananas in terms of the sort of people that are achieving high office. who do you have faith in? You can't really have faith in populist democracy exclusively anymore, but you can have faith, as Sumption points out, that judges are, in general, reasonably well educated, reasonably civilized, inclined to be moderate. So they can curb extremism, which is why, of course, speaking of political questions, David Panic or Lord Panic, I don't know, has sailed into the House of Lords or Supreme Court twice recently to stop the prorogation of Parliament and in relation to matters of Brexit, and they're going to the Scottish Court as well at the moment. Now, you might say, well, this is over-empowering lawyers and giving lawyers a greater sense of entitlement to shape things, and it's undemocratic. Now, all of that may be true if the democratic process is working, which it clearly isn't. And the reasons it isn't working is that, quite apart from dumbing down and slippage of standards, the manipulation of choice by media and the corporate control by media and the creation of disinformation, which Cambridge Analytica were so good at in engineering the result of the American presidential election, has created a structure where, absent political appointment structures, judges are at one level a counterweight. So that could be said also in Dworkin's favour. The other thing is Dworkin was a zealous proponent of judges, of lawyers, and in political terms, of the protection of certain rights. Now, he's a liberal in the classic American tradition, so therefore he doesn't really get social economic rights, food, shelter, housing. No American really does on a certain level. I mean, and it's an absence of his thought processes. But in terms of what might be called the conventional civil and political rights, he says some very interesting things. Leaving abortion, euthanasia aside, he has a fascinating piece in Freedom of Speech, which is called The Right to Ridicule. Now, it's a very important point. He wrote towards the tail end of his career. You have to, and an English judge called Sedley, and I wrote a piece in Freedom of Speech, said something similar. That, and I think Christopher Hitchens also does, that, and indeed Oscar Wilde, to multiply the quotations, you have to have a right to offend, shock, ridicule in terms of the European Court of Human Rights, and that a democracy does not function unless genuine criticism of a hard-headed nature is giving an appropriate audience. And increasingly in this world of balanced coverage and the presentation of utter mediocrities, talking nonsense in the aim of achieving nothing really, it's important, I think, to emphasize the right to tear people to pieces, to offend them and shock them and subject to huge levels of ridicule when they deserve it. And Dworkin was a fearless proponent of freedom of speech in that way as well. He's also, I think, a believer in equality. Now, and he follows on from the great American political philosopher John Rawls, who you might say should be more aptly put in this segment. Rawls's famous book, The Theory of Justice, is probably the most significant work of political philosophy of the 20th century. And, of course, the idea is that ultimately, that if you were in what he calls original position, though he backtracks on this later, where you didn't know your qualities or your characteristics, and you were forced to choose an ideal society, as the society got gradually revealed to you, you would choose a society which protected as much liberty as possible, because you would be oppressed, and you wouldn't want to fall below a certain level of income, a minimum standard even, of redistribution of wealth and resources. Now, those concepts of equality, which even Rawls and Dworkin have, are vitally important in this unequal world today. If you withdraw all layers of support structure of food, shelter, housing, if you do not give people a minimum standard or a degree of protection in terms of quality of that protection, then you are not going to enable them to be fully functional human beings if you want them to be so. And you're not going to achieve a society which is a just society. And there's no doubt that Rawls' social democratic society functions. All the evidence indicates that after the recession, those neoliberal countries have got worse and worse. Those countries which have social democratic commitments of a mixed economy, of a belief in a measure of social support as well as a market economy, have prevailed and been recession immune to some extent. The Nordic countries, or Germany and some of the Middle European countries. The model works. Growth has to be modulated and curtailed by a degree of equality. And if a society is structurally and substantively unequal in an extreme way, then it fosters and breeds even further extremism. Now, Rawls is more eloquent about this than Dworkin, but nonetheless, the most dominating human rights issue of our age is poverty in all its dimensions: equality, social exclusion, housing, healthcare, shelter, homelessness. And the agenda of the neoliberal cartelisation is to undermine human dignity by undermining all of these rights systematically, I think, in a deliberate way, or else you play ball with them and you become part of the problem in the first place. So Dworkin has, as a legal philosopher, straddling the boundaries of political philosophy and very much influenced by Ronald Dworkin, is still vitally important in this day and age.